Okay. So I've been told I'm the moderator, so I give away to you and to the rest. ¿Empezamos? Okay. So they are all on behalf of the S&D Group. I'm glad to welcome you to the workshop Treaty Changes, Our Progressive Vision Following the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is organized by the S&D Working Group in the Constitutional Affairs Committee, and with Gabby Bischoff, our Vice President for this topic, among others, in the group. I'm very happy to see such a large audience. Many of you have registered, 90 participants. So I think this is showing the importance of the topic and the interest that the workshop has raised. And also a special thanks to our stakeholders and strategic partners that are also present, apart from, of course, group members, and not only from AFCO, Vice President Marc Angel, Margarida Marquez, Pedro Silva, also Vice President and member of the AFCO team. I see also Pervenche Berès, who is participating later, former MEP. So, as you know, in this legislature, we have experienced the Conference on the Future of Europe, which has been an innovative tool of participation and deliberative democracy. As you know, as a result of this exercise, I will say far-reaching in the good sense of the word proposals have come out of this conference in terms of more, I will say, more Europe in terms of capabilities to act vis-à-vis the main transnational challenges, but also better Europe in terms of more democratic and more efficient in its decision-making and in its legitimacy. And we have, as a political group, been a strong supporter of the process of the conference and also of following up on the conference. And this is why we have had also, and we have, not in the past, Gabby Bischoff as the S&D co-rapporteur precisely on the report that the Parliament is elaborating on amendments to the treaties. It is very clear that we need to have a convention to implement the outcome of the conference in these two dimensions: more Europe, more social Europe, more environmental Europe, but also more democratic Europe. And in this regard, of course, the Spanish presidency of the European Union will be, we believe, critical in moving the timeline and the process forward. So without more substance, I'm happy to give the floor to Gabby Bischoff, as I said, Group Vice President and also co-rapporteur of the report on the reform of the treaties.
Thank you, Dominic, and good morning, everyone. It's so good to see you all in the room. I see so many comrades, friends, members of the Progressive Caucus of the Conference on the Future of Europe, that it's a pleasure to be here with you and discuss where we are standing and also our strategy for the next steps. Indeed, as Vice President of the group here, and also being one of the 6 co-rapporteurs on the report we are working on at the moment to amend the treaties. It is especially good to debate here with distinguished experts we have invited here, but also with you all that are interested. And I think we as S&D Group, we always had a strong vision for a social and democratic Europe. We wouldn't have needed the Conference on the Future of Europe, but we appreciated it and we initiated it because we wanted to have a bottom-up approach here for the necessary reforms. And this is why in all the work we are doing, that the starting point for us are the recommendations of this Conference on the Future of Europe here to reform the EU and also to propose changes in the different policy areas, because we still think that the conference offered a unique opportunity here for institutional representatives, for citizens, for civil society, social partners here to come up with strong proposals. And we have to say, when we had the idea, the Parliament pushing for involvement of citizens in this way, we couldn't have anticipated that already the process, the time when we do the conference, would already start important changes, because it was really an unprecedented situation. On one hand, first we had COVID, and within this experience, already some taboos broke regarding the road to an economic union. The citizens were debating, coming up with proposals, but we could already see changes happening also in the competence of health. I think everyone understood after this pandemic that we need, especially in cross-border situations like a pandemic, that we need more competences here, that we would be much better capable to act and faster here. And then we had the Russian aggression and the war against Ukraine here, which also showed and demonstrated concretely the importance of strategic autonomy. And with this also the goals of establishing an energy union, for example, or a common defense policy. And that was also the key point in the conference, our decision-making capacities. We can see that the support of citizens is growing again, but that it also depends on the union's capacity to act in difficult situations, and that it can show citizens that they are better off as European citizens in a European Union than there would be only with national solutions. And I think that is a good starting point, a good basis for us on the work we are doing at the moment, finding compromises in this House where and how to amend the treaties. So this called really for extraordinary and joint European solutions. But at the same time, I think we have to say, if we look at the 49 proposals, they were already quite anticipatory, quite progressive also, because they say, okay, we want results. We want to strengthen the EU's capacity to act, especially in areas where it's not the case, for example, and also become fairer, more sustainable. A whole generation is on the streets in many member states to say we need faster solutions here, digital, with a stronger voice also in the world. So, and when we look at our political and financial means, we can see that yet the EU is not equipped sufficiently, and this is why we embarked on this journey. We as S&D played really a crucial role also here in driving the Parliament's position on the future of Europe. Also, after the resolution we did in July already, calling for a European convention, we are now working indeed very hard in the AFCO report. We have to finish it next week. We still have some way to go, but we aim really at presenting it in the plenary in July. We cannot miss this opportunity here to enter a new phase of European integration and a process with ambitious reform. I think everyone agrees, almost everyone, that these times of muddling through are over. And to our view, institutional reforms are a precondition for making the EU more social, more sustainable, cohesive and accountable, and strengthened by directly engaging citizens through participatory mechanisms. We will also explore further in the future. And this is why we are delighted to have so many people here, not only experts, distinguished experts, but only active citizens, active representatives of NGOs, of organizations that share the same vision that we have, and also to engage in a common discussion here, how we can introduce these necessary institutional changes also, and to implement the political goals that we have. So I will try not to bore you, and already with a quick overview of some priorities we will be proposing in the framework of the AFCO report. I said it's not finished yet, but we already have some common lines here, and also with some of the points that are really key to our heart as S&D Group, because we were driving very much also for changes in social and economic issues, but also energy, health, gender equality, and not to mention also really some institutional changes necessary. So I will just highlight some points. I'm sure we will have time also with the experts to go into more details. One thing that the citizens gave us as an overall task is to say, come on, let's move to qualified majority in almost all policy areas. Because the way decisions are done is not working anymore with 27, and this is something also where we have a compromise of all pro-European political parties in this House to do so. And I think this would be a major step forward. The incorporation of the Social Progress Protocol and also the social pillar into the treaties was a key element, and I think every political group in this House knew we wouldn't go along if we wouldn't get this. So I think this is also, in terms of social Europe, a major progress. New shared competences in public health matters. I mentioned it, the experience of the pandemic was very clear here. And it helped also to come on joint positions here. Also, new exclusive competences on the fight against climate change is essential. We know it, we owe it to the next generation, so I hope we are going to do that. And a stronger role of the EP for a full, more democratic union, right of initiative, right of inquiry, on electoral law. This was something also the citizens gave us in their package of 49 proposals, said this is something that needs to be done. Also, stronger powers of the parliament in the budget procedures is a key element also for a more democratic union. And last but not least, and with this I will close here, is we fight in this House jointly for rule of law, for democracy, for respect here, and we need more effective procedures on Article 7 for breaches of EU values, and this is also something we are going to propose here. And I will end with, for us, gender equality and a stronger basis, legal basis for anti-discrimination is key. This is also something that we have in this package. Hopefully, I mean, everything is agreed when the package is finalized, but I'm optimistic then that we can go here. We have other areas where we still have to work over the weekend, next week, but I'm confident that we will manage to have a package that can open this new chapter of integration. But I know also this is just the first step of the game, because I think we need all of you, we need everyone to put up the pressure on the Council to start the next phase, that we will have a convention, and this is when the real work starts, as I'm going to say it. So I wish everyone here to be good involved in these debates, and I will hand over back to Dominic as moderator to say I'm very pleased to be here with you and debate with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Gabi, also for the concrete achievements that you outlined that are going to be in the report and that we have been fighting for as a political family even before the conference, because we had a similar seminar as this one, maybe some of you remember. Maria Joao, you were there, also with the study from FEPS, and there was this S&D paper with ideas for the conference, like the ones Gabi just mentioned, climate neutrality to be enshrined in the treaty, the incorporation of the social pillar into the treaty. So we're making progress. So what it first is a policy paper from the group that then is going to be part of the Parliament position for the triggering of Article 48. Now we are starting the first panel with Maria Joao Rodriguez and Jean-Paul Jacquet. Thank you for being here with us. Maria Joao is, I think, very well known, but nonetheless, I will remind that is the president of FEPS, which is our think tank of the European Social Democrats, and has been also MEP and vice president of S&D Group in the previous term. And you have been working a lot from the FEP side, producing one study already, which is the one outside, and one in the making, which is also feeding into our policy process and our proposals for the next phase, which is the convention. So thanks very much, Maria Joao, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Many thanks for this invitation. And well, this is a great initiative, as Dominic and Gabi are just introducing this topic. Such an important initiative because, in fact, we start some time ago. And in the meantime, it was possible to launch the Conference on the Future of Europe and the Portuguese presidency. It was possible to unblock the situation. We had many skeptical people by that time, but then in the end, it proved to be a very important process of participatory democracy. And we could see that there is a lot of common ground between European citizens, and there is really a lot of common vision about what should be the next phase of the European project. So in the end, it proves a very interesting experience. And that's why now the European Parliament is honoring the expectation created by the Future of Europe by preparing this report, very important report, led by AFCO committee, but involving many other committees of the Parliament. And the approach proposed by the citizens, I believe it was quite wise, because they wanted a Europe delivering on their concerns, on their aspirations. And then they said, well, sometimes we can do it under the Lisbon Treaty, but we also need to recognize that for other purposes, the Lisbon Treaty has some limits. This was, in general, the conclusion of the Conference of the Future of Europe. And that's why the Parliament decided to move ahead with this report. And now we have this workshop as an input in a much larger process. So, in the meantime, we could also ask, but is all this still viable? Because we have a completely different context. Notably created by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and everything stemming from this. Is this still viable? Well, let me tell you a 1-minute story what happened to us in Lisbon when we were preparing a Portuguese presidency and we had just lost the constitutional treaty after the negative referendum in France and Netherlands, and everybody was saying, forget it, we cannot have a new treaty. But I can tell you that in the meantime, we were really hoping for the opportunity. And when the opportunity came under the Portuguese presidency, we were prepared. We had technically a proposal prepared. And that's why the Lisbon Treaty became possible. So this is a lesson I think we should have in mind. Now it seems that perhaps it's not so viable, but from my viewpoint, the question is this necessary? This is the important question. Is this necessary? Well, in our European Foundation, FAPS, we have conducted an exercise involving high-level expertise exactly to assess precisely the potential of the Lisbon Treaty. If we can do it with the Lisbon Treaty, this is great. But sometimes we could also identify where are the limits. And my intervention today will be about the limits because, well, I know that I need to be very short. Well, we concluded that there are 5 main reasons why we should improve the treaty. First of all, with an approach which consists of upgrading competencies from complementary competencies to shared competencies, and sometimes from shared competencies to exclusive competencies. This is a method. A second method, Gabi just referred to this, is to extend the so-called ordinary legislative procedure, meaning qualified majority voting in the Council plus co-decision competences attributed to the European Parliament. So this is the how we could go beyond the Lisbon Treaty. Now, let me be concrete about what should be upgraded. The first reason is because, in fact, we are dealing with a completely different international environment, and we need to upgrade competencies regarding European external action as a whole, including when negotiating, for instance, the climate agreements in COP. We need to have a much better coordinated position, but certainly when it comes foreign affairs, because we need to have a special kind of qualified majority, not the general one, but the super qualified majority voting should be the solution to overcome the risk of vetoes, because we have been dealing with the vetoes during particularly the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And there is a second concern here is the so-called, in fact, strategic autonomy, because we need to have strategic autonomy when it comes cybersecurity, when it comes industrial policy, food security. There are different dimensions where we have been seeing during the war that, in fact, we need to have stronger competences to decide and to act. So all in all, this is the first reason we need to improve the treaty. Then there is a second one, which is we need to have a stronger democratic capacity to shape the green transition and the digital transition with social cohesion. This is our, let's say, development model. And for the next phase of the European project, many decisions need to be taken in this direction. So, example, we should move to shared competencies when it comes industrial policy, when it comes trans-European networks. It will be easier to deliver real trans-European networks. On the digital area, let me remind that in the Lisbon Treaty, we don't have the word digital. When we concluded the Lisbon Treaty, the digital transformation was taking shape, but it was the beginning. So our conclusion is that we should introduce a new title in the treaties dealing with digital policies. And then on the social dimension, yes, with the social pillar, we have conducted, in fact, a qualitative leap, comprehending all the social policies for all European citizens. So this is a major transformation of the social dimension. And in fact, this should be translated in a general legislative procedure for all social policies which are in our side, the employment, the social protection, including in health and education. We need to improve because in certain aspects of health policy and of education policy, we should move from complementary competencies towards shared competencies. And then we have a third reason, very important, is to have the means to deliver all this, meaning the budgetary capacity. And we suggest that when it comes to the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact, we should have a kind of golden rule with a precise approach, which is to focus precisely on the delivering European public goods, which should be identified by the European institutions as priority public goods. A good example happened during the pandemics, in fact, because we create more fiscal room at national level to finance health spending. This is an extremely good example on how we can introduce a wise golden rule compatible with fiscal responsibility. But this is not enough. We should in fact create a permanent, stronger European budgetary capacity backed by the capacity of the European Union to borrow. So we should introduce in the treaties a specific provision creating the European capacity to borrow, provided this is fully backed by European own resources. This is a very precise condition. Which brings us to the problem of own resources, because own resources should also be adopted by the normal legislative procedure. Finally, when it comes to taxation, we need to introduce new sources of taxation, but we also need to introduce the principle of tax coordination. The concept of tax coordination is not clear enough in the Lisbon Treaty. The fourth reason is the democratic one. Very important, starting with the rule of law, so introducing a more clear mechanism to impose respect for the rule of law, but also improving our representative democracy, the role of the parliament in the budgetary decisions, the need to improve the European electoral system, and also introducing participatory democracy at all levels. As the future of Europe has proved, it is such a great potential to have this large participation of citizens. Final reason why. This is the famous equation of the European integration. Enlargement versus deepening. Well, in fact, this is not about either or. We need both. We need enlargement. Enlargement now is political, in fact, a moral imperative, because we need to protect and give a perspective to the European countries fighting for democracy close to our borders. But we also know that in order to have enlargement without paralyzing the European Union, we need to introduce some institutional reforms, and that's why we need the deepening I was calling for. My final conclusion is the following. The approach we are suggesting is based on a fundamental idea, is that for next phase of the European project, we can no longer conduct the European ambition just with a technocratic approach. We need to base this phase on much stronger European citizenship. From my viewpoint, this is the central concept of the next phase. I believe it's possible to have stronger support of European citizens regarding the European project if we involve them much better at all levels, from the local to the European. If we prove that we can decide and act to protect European citizens in our external action across the world, but mainly because we can deliver, deliver new European public goods meeting their aspirations, and their concerns. And let me conclude with some concrete examples. Let's imagine a Europe with the capacity to decide and to act on building real trans-European networks for the energy transition, for the green economy, for the open access to the digital transformation. Let's imagine that we have a real European cloud and data space. Let's imagine that we can have artificial intelligence supporting European public services. Let's imagine that we can count on European degrees and the European Open University. And let's imagine that we can count on much more projects of European public interest, delivering smart investments, better jobs. And finally, let's imagine that we have Europe delivering a social pillar in all fronts for all citizens, and notably with the flagships we have created, the Youth Initiative, Youth Guarantee, Child Guarantee, minimum income, minimum wage, and general access to social protection. All these requires some target changes in the Lisbon Treaty. It's not a complete transformation. I'm meaning a short list of target changes, but they can really make a difference. So this was the conclusion of our expert group, and many thanks for our collaboration.
Thanks a lot, Maria Joao. There's a lot to say, but we will save it for the debate. I will not abuse my position as moderator. And I give the floor now to Professor Jean-Paul Jacquet, who is a professor at the College of Europe and is a leading expert on legal and institutional questions or topics. So please, Professor, the floor is yours. And thank you for being with us.
It work? Ah, merci. Je disais merci.
Thank you very much. I was sent quite a broad list of speaking points. Obviously, I won't be able to cover them all. Amongst all of the proposals for revising the treaties which have been made, I think it's important to distinguish two categories here, the institutional category that I will touch on later, and those that affect specific areas, such as enlarging competences or other areas. I think amongst these different issues relating to competences that I have read, there are different types of proposals. Some are purely decorative. They actually express things which are already covered in the treaties. I have no objection to adding this extra layer of decoration, so to speak, to the treaties, but I don't think it's really necessary. Trans-European networks, for example, is this something that affects digital? No. These are different things that we have to identify. So there are things that are nice, that are pretty to write into the treaties, but they're not really getting to the heart of the debate. On the areas where we really could do more, I would like to draw your attention to changes in categories for the competences. Now, we do need to see those changes, but where are they really necessary and where could they be counterproductive? I saw that there was unanimous support to include environment amongst the EU's exclusive competences. Now, I am not against this, but we need to look carefully at the consequences that this might have. When you have an exclusive competences, the member states no longer have the right to intervene. When it comes to areas of exclusive competence, then the principle of subsidiarity no longer plays a role. So you will deprive the member states of any possibility of acting individually here. And if the EU chooses not to act, then the member states don't have the right to do anything. So I would suggest that we think very carefully about how we would word what is going to be an exclusive competence, because we don't want to have any counterproductive effects here. I would also like to raise another point, because I think it is interesting amongst these proposals. There is a proposal made in the interests of the citizens, a small modification to an article related to the Court of Justice that allows the citizens to challenge union decisions when they are individually and directly concerned by such judgments, because this would be limiting the effects of citizens when it comes to challenging court rulings. But if we do change this, what would the effects be? Now, citizens aren't necessarily informed of these rulings. They're not going to go to the EU courts, they're going to go to the national courts to challenge these rulings, but they will not be valid in those national jurisdictions. They will be told, why didn't you challenge that directly at the European Court of Justice? So by trying to do something for the citizens without fundamentally really understanding what the consequences of that will be, you can again have counterproductive effects. So I think you need to be extremely cautious when it comes to looking at these competences and looking at how what the technical impacts of this will be. So you do need to have those changes, but you need to do that very cautiously. If you want to change things that are already existing, that's one thing, but otherwise I think we need to be extremely vigilant. Now, for health, I think we do need to see a change in the category there. For industry, again, I think that's something that we can consider. In the area of social matters, we certainly should enlarge the competences, but we do need to think about the long-term consequences of what we are doing to avoid possibly damaging consequences. So I have begun there by urging caution. I know that you are cautious, so perhaps that warning isn't necessary, but I wanted to say it nevertheless. Let us think now about the institutions. I think, and you're probably all in agreement here, we do not create institutions for the sake of it. I think any change to the institutions has to have a purpose. It's not simply for the intellectual satisfaction of having created something nice or attractive. It has to be something that is functional. So I share your views, but I would perhaps make an additional point of caution here. We have an overall institutional framework that is based on a twofold legitimacy. First of all, that of the member states and of the direct legitimacy of the European Parliament. Is that something we want to change? Certain suggestions here makes me think we want to move to a completely parliamentary system compared to the federal aspect. So we need to think carefully about what we want here. By reinforcing the Parliament, are we then reducing the role of the member states within the system? Or are we talking about a necessary rebalancing of the system? And that is something that we need to bear in mind when we look at these reform proposals. What type of system do we want? Do we want to have a balanced federal system, or do we want to move to a more parliamentarian system that then erases the federal aspects? So a rebalancing means limiting the powers of council. That's not surprising. I think that has always been the wish of the institution where we are here today. Rebalancing the council's powers, how would that be done? Well, would that be qualified majority, for example, in every aspect where we can? So I've read certain drafts that have been circulating. This is a question of touching up the treaties and crossing out unanimity and changing that for qualified majority wherever possible. So this might be necessary, but the rules themselves will not lead to the change you want. So you might change the rules, but you should not be naive when looking at the reality here. What is going to make the difference here are the practices rather than the rules. Now, you might welcome this or regret this depending what side you're on, but despite the rules, in the cases where council has to agree by qualified majority voting, according to the most recent calculations, in over 83% of the cases, de facto those decisions are made in a unanimous way. So you might write qualified majority voting everywhere you wish, but the rule that will apply in practice in council is still that of the common accord. So we should be aware of what our words actually mean. Now, am I saying this is useless? No. A rule can be imposed in extreme cases. Now, of course, the council will always try and agree based on consensus, but there may be cases where decisions have to be made because that is imposed on them by the political situation. And there might be one country that is particularly recalcitrant or hesitant. But I don't think we can hope for more than that. Moving to qualified majority voting, I believe, is necessary. But do not think that that will lead to a more generalized use of qualified majority voting. It is simply going to be something used in the most extreme cases, although that is already a good thing. I agree with what you're saying. There are cases when moving to qualified majority voting has to be applied with caution. I don't want to go into this again, but for example, in the area of foreign policy and security policy, we have talked about the possibility of reinforced qualified majority voting in these cases. If in these types of areas we move to a simple qualified majority voting, the member states simply aren't going to execute these decisions, and they are the ones that can enforce these decisions. So otherwise, it's just going to be pointless. I think one particular example, and I'm sure you'll remember this, not in the area of foreign policy, but was the decision on the relocalization of migrants. This was adopted by qualified majority voting, but this was never actually implemented. So we need to be pragmatic here. Do we prefer decisions that don't actually lead to any execution in reality? So we have the super qualified majority voting, or a possibility for a member state that doesn't want to associate itself with that decision to not participate and to not implement this decision. So having an opt-out for a member state on a particular decision. So these choices are possible, but I think PESC, for a common foreign and security policy, that might need separate treatment. So in the end, does this strengthen the democratic legitimacy of the EU? I don't think so. I don't think it's through institutional changes that we create greater democratic legitimacy. Now, we might be very fond of the framework, the architecture, but sacrificing your life, that's something quite different. So I think that there are simpler ways to enforce democratic legitimacy or create it from scratch where it never really existed. I think having these conventions associating citizens, that's important. But if it's not really widely discussed, then what's the point? Legitimacy is achieved through voting, through participation. Now, we might regret this, but we are shown through every crisis that those who have the real legitimacy are the heads of state and government. Citizens believe that. They believe those are the ones that are responsible for their future and their fate. So that is the reality. So how do we move that legitimacy and confer more of that onto our institutions? I think by creating a stronger political dimension to our institutions. I don't think the institutional changes, as I said, are what are going to make the difference. It's about having a greater political dimension to our system. You might ask me how we would do that. And I think that's by creating true European political parties. So moving beyond national political debates and broadening those and having political discussions on true European on a true European scale. And when I say real European political parties, they're parties with members that choose their leaders and do this very transparently. Parties that are able to invest or co-invest when it comes to candidates for European Parliament elections. So the electoral debate should not be a national political debate, but these European political parties should be directly involved. And there are ways to do that. And this is not necessarily through a revision of the treaties, but that is having transnational voting lists and constituencies. So people can vote directly for these people from European political parties, vote for these people who have campaigned, who have justified their selection. And I think it is in this way that we create a true democratic legitimacy. In our democracies, parties choose who will eventually form a government. They have a responsibility to educate their citizens through political debate and to focus their policies on the future. We do not have democratic legitimacy without that true political spirit. It's at the moment just confined to a faraway framework in Europe. So we may reform the treaties, we might have institutions in perfect working order, we may face all of the challenges that arise, but we will not have truly built the link between us and the citizens, and we will always seem somewhat artificial. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Professor Jacquet.
Thank you very much, Professor Jacquet. Of course, we'd just like to say something to start out the debate. I think that there is not a contradiction between working to reform the treaty. Gabi and Maria Joao explained the idea of this, and when you said that you would agree to go to qualified majority, that would be, for extreme cases, that's already something, because remember Hungary and Poland blocking some of the recovery plans. Now, in a case like that, if we can use qualified majority for the approval of the multi-annual financial, it would be a very important solution, one way out. But I was saying there is no contradiction between finding new instruments, new institutional instruments like qualified majority, and at the same time, I very much agree we need to get stronger political processes, and the Parliament has made proposals. They're working on the reform of the treaty with Gabi's report. I was rapporteur on the electoral law, which is proposing transnational electoral laws. So I think we've got some complementary aspects. Thank you again, and I think these are very important points to give us a political vision which is supported legally. Now, we're going to go on to the debate, open the floor here. I see quite a few MEPs. I see Margarita and Mark and Margarita, and then we'll talk to other colleagues in the cell. Thank you very much. I didn't really want to be the first one to take the floor, but as you said, there were several members. I thought all the others had asked for the floor. Anyway, firstly, thank you for organizing this debate. And I'm sorry, Gabi and Dominique, but I'd like especially to thank Maria Joao and Jean-Paul Jacquet. I really think that these are two contributions which really tabled and showed how complex this exercise was going to be. And let me explain why I think that. Because when Maria Joao made her presentation, for each point, what I was doing as an exercise was to try to understand whether what Maria Joao was proposing could be done within the Lisbon Treaty. And this is how I followed your presentation, and I actually could not see constraints in this treaty which would preclude developing the policies that you suggested. Now, of course, some of the points you raised would be clearer if we had targets or very specific changes in the treaty. I agree with that. Now, some of the issues you raise, and I'm sure that you're quite aware of certain things, you're aware of that we raised these questions already before the Lisbon Treaty, at the last convention, all these the constitutional treaty to the Lisbon Treaty. We debated this. You and I and others defended principles that we could not get introduced into the Lisbon Treaty, but there is some room for maneuver. So to conclude, I should say that we will we'll have advantages if we change certain target modifications like the 3% and the 60% of the debt and the definite deficit in the protocols, which would be annexes to the treaty. That's one good example. But going from unanimity to quality or absolute majority, you can do it with the bridge clause. We never did it. I was rapporteur for the MFF, and at one point we tried to tell the Commission, if we keep dealing with this issue, we're going to try to use the bridge clause. Now, it turned out not to be necessary, but there was a legal possibility within the treaty to solve that problem if we couldn't find consensus. Now, Mr. Jacquet, what you said, well, I think they're kind of throwing cold water on those who have a vision of a future treaty. But I very much agree with the questions that you mentioned. We do have to keep in mind what we can do and what we can compare and what type of revision of the treaty we can carry out and what the political priorities are for the citizens. So I think we have to see how we can deal with political motivations and the will, because this will shape the results. As I've been saying, we've not been able to use the bridge clause. We've never done it. Member states didn't want to do it. Will they want to do that? Will they really want to extend the bridge clause in a new treaty to actually move from unanimity to qualified majority? And then secondly, the competence question, and what we're seeing, and my prime ministers raise this question often, what we often see is that if we draw a map with the one-by-one competence that member states want, some member states want to strengthen the political powers in other areas, whereas others want to cut back on political actions. And this, you can see this in the enforced cooperation exercise. I think one thing is clear for all of us. If we're going to review the treaty and revise it, of course the socialists, at least we as socialists, have very concrete proposals as to how to change the treaty. I was the rapporteur in the Econ Committee, and we made very concrete proposals. Now, to finish, we cannot just leave behind some of the ambitions we have because we are waiting for the treaty to be changed. We've got to use every possibility within the treaty right now that we have. Thank you.
Okay, let's proceed. But I think we agree with the last point. It's not one or the other. We want to take advantage to the fullest of the current constitutional framework, but also we want to go further. I think Mark also wants the floor. Pedro, but please, because the staff is looking to me not in a very nice way, so keep it short, and then we have also a very short reaction from the panel, okay?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm happy that we organized this follow-up of the Conference on the Future of Europe, and I recall that these 49 proposals are not the initial proposals of the citizens, but they have been reformulated in a very democratic way in the working groups where national parliaments were present, where the Council was present, where the Commission was present, and where many MEPs were present. So these 49 proposals, they have already been adapted a little bit. And yes, we can do a lot of these proposals in reality with policy change, with legislation, but there is this little bit which is left. And I think you mentioned it very well, Maria Joao, a list of targeted changes, a small list of targeted changes are necessary. And this is also important because nobody wants to open a Pandora box, but we have to be very targeted and come back to these proposals from the Conference on the Future of Europe. And then, of course, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec le professeur Jacquet.
I absolutely agree with Professor Jacquet. We need to be cautious. We need to be very cautious, and I convention would give us time to discuss and be cautious. And I hope that the next convention will not be a black room like the previous convention, but that we will use the model of the Conference on the Future of Europe, and that we will have this convention be rather more transparent. Secondly, you spoke about various measures which are purely decorative. They may be decorative, but I would use the term that explicative, that many citizens, in discussions with citizens, we've seen that there's a great deal in the treaty already which is not very clear, and perhaps to help this, I think that's why we are also doing this exercise, which may be a little more decorative. And I've also seen, and social Europe is very important to us, and the position that Gabi presented, these are very important for our political family, because I don't want to hear anymore when we want to advance social Europe. There are colleagues in Parliament who say that Europe has nothing to say on the social side, and this is something where we need to really work on this social dimension in our treaties. And the last point, as I'm very active in anti-discrimination matters,
which are not included in the actual treaty. And when I see Helena Dalli, the Commissioner for Equality, she has her hands bind because she cannot do everything, because some of the grounds of discrimination are not included in the treaty and in our charter, and therefore we need to discuss this. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Very good points. Pedro.
Well, first of all, let me thank our guests. Two topics I would like to raise, one on democracy and the other one on economic governance. Now, on democracy, I fully agree with the warnings. We really want to destruct this double legitimacy that we have in the European construction. The trend in the last few years has been to reinforce the position of the Parliament, the role of the Parliament, and I think we should continue in that path. But what we want from the part of the Council is mostly to avoid a blockage in the Council, so that the Council can react, and then to improve the relationship between the Council and the Parliament, so that the Parliament is stronger in this relationship. In fact, the reason why people vote less in the European elections than in other elections probably is because they believe those European elections are less important than the national elections. So perhaps there is something more we could do in order to make people understand that the Parliament is strong and the vote in the European elections is meaningful. It has a consequence on the way Europe is being governed and who governs, in fact, Europe. So I wonder if some movement in that direction would not be important to improve our democracy. Then on economic governance, I was happy to see that there are proposals in this area, but also surprised because we've been seeing a battle here in this Parliament about fiscal capacity for a long time. So I would be surprised if suddenly we can get a political consensus on a permanent budgetary capacity, although I would welcome that. So my question is, do you really think that a permanent budgetary capacity, a capacity of borrowing based on own resources, is politically viable at this stage? And finally, I don't see a reference here to the inclusion in the treaties of the European Stability Mechanism, which is still an intergovernmental body. There was the intention to make it part of the European institutions. The fact that it is not in the list of measures, it tells us something about the lack of political will to ensure this fiscal capacity and all the European instruments in terms of economic governance.
Muy bien, pues muchas gracias a los tres colegas que han intervenido.
Thank you very much. Thank you to those three colleagues who have taken the floor. We're a little behind time, so I would ask, Pascal Durand has just come in. We'll take you in the next round, but perhaps you could respond just in 1 minute. You obviously don't have to respond to all of the questions. If there's a particular interest that was raised that you'd like to touch on, if you could possibly cover that in just 1 minute, and we'll start with Mr. Jacquet.
Un minute.
OK. Il faut, dans une proposition de révision,
In a proposal for revising a treaty, we would do as much as possible, and then we will see. Remember Spinelli and the Spinelli Treaty. He asked for as much as possible and had to wait 30 years for it to be implemented, and it was introduced bit by bit in the treaties up to Lisbon. So don't be mistaken, the key moment for introducing things is enlargement. And it's since Amsterdam that we've been reviewing treaties and that we've been giving Spinelli to the member states in bits. And the process will be the same. So have a plan and make the member states swallow it bit by bit over the course of events. And we've not talked about the rule of law. We talked about whether there was the things to do. Initially, talking about a breach, this needs to be done by an independent organization, by the court, not the member states. And once this has been independently stated, the member states will have to take their responsibilities directly. There won't be discussions over whether there is a risk of a breach. That's a purely political discussion. We take that away and just give the sanctions that they will have to respond to.
On parlera de ça aussi.
We'll speak about that as well. Maria Joao.
Many thanks for this very interesting debate. We could go on, but I will be very short. The passerelle possibility. Let me remind that the passerelle mechanism is a very complex one, because it requires not only ratification, endorsement by all European institutions, but by all national parliaments. Each item to be exposed to the passerelle, which means that each time we want to use the passerelle, we need to ensure all these large ratification. That's why even it seems very bold, it might be easier to have a convention with a limited mandate. This is the paradox of the situation we are in. Which brings me to the issue of the opportunity, because last time we ran a convention, in fact, the convention had no time to update the treaties. Most of the European policies were not updated, because the European Council said to the convention, now you stop. This is the real story. That's why the Lisbon Treaty had is not based on a proper updating of many, many European policies. And now they are even more outdated. So my point, and this is my final proposal, is that let's be prepared, because we never know. If the opportunity comes, at least we are prepared. And that's why this work is so important. And how can the opportunity come? Look, let me remind what happened to us during the COVID. It was due to the shock of the pandemic that finally we could agree on something we are fighting for during a painful Eurozone crisis to have common issues of bonds. This was not possible with the terrible cost. And then it was in front of a symmetric shock with asymmetric impacts, the pandemic, that finally this qualitative leap took place. So we still don't know what, for instance, this war will bring about. This is a terrible perspective. Many difficult situations might come. We don't know. And in a certain moment, the opportunity comes, and by that time, we'll not regret to have done this very important work.
Gabi?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I will focus again to see that many of the proposals the citizens did give are covered by change of policies, and the Commission took it up. But there were focused ones and proposals where the citizens ask us to debate it and come up with a proposal. And I will highlight, Margarita, 2-3 examples. With the Social Progress Protocol, we will rebalance economic and social rights, and that will be something we don't have yet. We also, if we look at the health chapter and the competences here, it's one of the experience of the pandemic that we need. And I always said, everyone in the room of the parliament and the others that knows me, I always say, from the beginning, we didn't perceive this as a Christmas tree. But really, Maria said it, very targeted treaty changes, essential to achieve, that will be necessary if we want to deliver more and have a European Union capable to act. And I see also, it will not be do magic. I mean, also we have to be clear here, but essential. And I always want to highlight also to Pedro, this is something in the beginning I mentioned where we still have our fights to do. We will see how far we get, but also here with our proposals, we cannot do magic. We have to do it. We do a package. There's always something in a package that is very good for some parts and something that is not easy to swallow. That's how it works. And we are still working on this part here especially. But I think, as Maria said, we now have some good examples that we did in the pandemic and with the war to say, okay, here we need a golden rule, for example, and space. And let me use the opportunity again from the side of the Parliament and as one of the rapporteurs to thank Maria and the FEPS, because in the whole process we had a lot of intellectual support also during the conference that was essential to do our job here properly. So thank you again. And I have to leave you because I'm also the rapporteur of a very important social file, and we will have a shadow meeting now to continue, because we don't give up all the other things in policy areas. We still want social progress to be achieved until the end of this plenary, and we will not give it up. So thank you very much, and thank you also for all the contributions.
Thank you, Gabi. So we conclude the first panel, and we move to the second panel, which is new progressive policies for more solidarity. Maybe we can invite Pervenche Beres, Peter Bofinger, Nicoletta Pirozzi, and Marco Silento to come to the table. They are online. So Okay, well, so as you have seen, this seminar has two dimensions. We have tackled, obviously, not everything, but the first dimension was devoted to the institutional part, and this second one is the policy aspect, because as you know, the treaty has these two dimensions. The things that we give to the Union as a policy task, but also the institutional, how we make the decisions about these policies. So both in the conference, we discuss democracy and policies. Now the report in which Gabi is working tackles policies, but also the institutional side. For us as socialists, the two are very important. So what we want is a more social and more democratic Europe. So for this second aspect, the aspect of the policies, we have this second panel. And in the first place, we have Pervenche Berès, who is a former member of the S&D group for 25 years. Also coordinator in the former coordinator in the Econ Committee, but also a member of the AFCO Committee, and now also a member of the Franco-German expert group on EU reform. The only thing is this panel, it's unlike the other one, it's 4 of you, so please try to be like maybe no more than 7 minutes, so there is time for everyone, and then also for debate. Thank you, Pervenche. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be among you, especially on these topics that are topics we always need to address. I chair a think tank in Paris where we try to promote the French language, so I'm going to speak in French, and I believe most of you will be happy with this. Je ne vais pas parler
I'm not going to speak on behalf of the Franco-German working group, because this is a group which was set up, I'm sure you saw, at the 60th anniversary of the Élysée Treaty between Alain Normand and Laurence Bonne, who were the leaders of European affairs in the two governments. Now, of course, we owe our conclusions to those two ministers, which we still haven't drawn up. But I'd just like to tell you, normally we should have a little report before the summer, and kind of an interim report, and then the final report will come out in September. So right now, this morning, I'm speaking personally. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this panel, because this is the one that we're really interested in. And I'd like to show my full agreement with Professor Jacquet that when he says legitimacy is not just going to come from the institutions, but from the policies. I don't quite share that conclusion or that assumption, but I didn't actually make that conclusion, but I think he's right. For all institutions, this is true, but the European institutions, often they're further from the citizens, difficult to understand because they're quite conflict. The issue of output and what purpose we have to have common rules and common obligations. That the institutions have to do the same thing. It's a major question, and all of those who've worked with me know how it is. It's not that I'm tired of institutional reform. I think it's intrinsically necessary, but we can't sell it politically. We can't sell that idea politically. Now, do we make the jump through the political parties? Well, because of the situation of political parties in European democracy, I think we may need to deal with another field where we've got more questions than answers for the time being. But based on our political objectives, how can we achieve this? And I heard what you said in the previous table round, extensions of competence of the EU, extending competences for health, environment, digital aspects on the budget, taxation, etc. Okay, all well and good, but if you look at the reality of what's actually happening in the EU, well, do we always need, does it always have to go through a change in the treaty? I saw what happened during COVID, where the Commission, without any mandate in an area that they weren't competent in, was able to work with the treaties as they were to require European pharmaceuticals industries, member states and others, to accept a vaccine to be managed directly by the Commission in a very directive way, and how to prepare the vaccine, manufacture it, and distribute it. Don't forget that. Let's not just see our failures, but let's see what successes we have had, because, well, maybe because I was member of the 2 conventions, and you all know that for the 2nd convention, I brought in a conclusion which was not shared by everybody, but I certainly learned a lot. This is not the institutional party that we've been dreaming of. Do not believe that we're going to make this great treaty, and Professor Jacquet was right once again. We can write up the Spinelli Treaty, but don't think we're going to be able to implement it right away. The citizens wrote up in the COF. We pretty much agree with everything that COFE said. But do you think that one member state will buy the whole thing? Do you think that every member state wants a new convention and that they'll buy it up? Well, sometimes we need symbols, so we need to have something that looks like a convention. But don't expect much of it, because the heads of government and states hold the key. We don't like it, but that's the way it is. And in their key, something is going to be imposed upon them. 2 things. And this is our work in a way as a Franco-German. This is the rule of law, because that is the basis of the EU. Democracy is the basis. Whether it is not led well, that may be true. We're going to have to do something because our treaty is being weakened. But whether we like it or not, we're seeing something like what we call enlargement. And I agree again with Professor Jacquet. There's a leverage here, and then we have the debate. Should we have, if is what we do, not through some great evening, but do we have to take every step? Is enlargement imperative to implement the rule of law? Should we put it in a text before the enlargement or in the enlargement text? I think we have to put it in the text, because the treaties have to change when we have the enlargement, the number of MEPs and the number of commissioners. You want a package? If you want to enlarge, do it. But I'm just speaking kind of my lingo. I mean, you have to look what we have to put in these changes. If we want to move forward, we're going to be in a Europe of 35 pretty change. Now, maybe it'll be like Spinelli. It might not be overnight, but we're going to reach 35. Do you really think we're going to be able to have the same policies as we did before? Remember what we did with the British, so they wouldn't disturb us. We didn't have a happy ending with the British. They might not come back right away, but one day they opted out of Europe, but that hasn't stopped us from moving forward. So we really need to think that there's not going to be this overnight change, and we have to decide on crucial issues with a concept that we don't like. I'm a Cartesian, I'm French, I'm of the Marxist view, but we're going to have to be flexible and introduce flexibility. What does that mean? Well, we need the qualified majority everywhere, keeping in mind that the council always decides everything. unanimously. And look what happens in the council. They come forward and they have these so-called constructive abstentions, which took place on taxation, certain areas related to foreign trade. So in the institutional reforms, the major ones, you've got the rule of law, which is an important issue, and we've got to blow up what's blocking the absolute or qualified majority, 152 against 151. But anyway, we've got to have that in the Verhofstadt report. But I don't agree with Maria here. Enforced cooperation, the passerelle clause, are not flexibility tools. They actually are locks, because we're not able to use them. So we've got to reflect on the qualified majority, a tailor-made one, which might be variable, which won't make things more simple, but it will help us succeed, so that if a country that doesn't want to participate doesn't prevent others from doing it. We don't want blocking minorities, but we just want to not prevent them from reacting. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Seulement 2 minutes, trop long. Merci, merci.
Thank you, Pervenche, for your contribution. It's true that I would say on the question of enlargement, we need to say that we also need the reform. We need to connect those two things, because we know that there are member states who are very much in favour of enlargement. So for those groups of member states, we need to say, yes, but you need to support us in the other part. But now we will move on to Peter Boffinger, who is the Chair for Monetary Policy and International Economics at Würzburg University.
Member of the German Council of Economic Experts, who is going to speak online. So please, Professor Boffinger, well, thank you for being with us. Again, if you could stick to 7, 8 minutes.
Thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm joining you from the Canary Islands, where the connection is not perfect, and the only connection that I found to be somehow stable is outside. So if you hear a bird interfering, so please excuse this. Okay, so I will talk about the economic dimension and the implications of the economic dimension on treaty changes. The next slide, please. And it's obvious that we are facing unprecedented economic challenges right now. We are undergoing a great transformation of the European economy to factors which you all know: climate change, decarbonization, deployment and development of renewable energy sources. We need alternative sources for strategically important raw materials. We have digitalization, we have demographics. And what I think is very important, we have a growing strategic competition by China and the United States. Next slide, please. And I think it's really important to have in mind that the challenge posed by the United States is not only related to the Inflation Reduction Act, but other acts like the CHIPS and Science Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, which provide about 1.3 billion, 1,300 billion of financing for investments in the United States. And as you can see on this chart, there are many companies now reacting to this offer by the U.S. government, establishing new firms on semiconductors, on batteries, and so on and so on. So I think this is a huge challenge right now for Europe. If you read newspapers every day, you can see new companies saying, okay, we go to the US because these financial subsidies are so high. So next slide. What does this mean? We need fiscal space for the financing of transformative investments in the EU. And where does the fiscal space come from? Well, it can come from the national level, it can come from intergovernmental arrangements, and it can come from the EU level. If we talk about the financial space at the national level, there are two restrictions. One are legal or constitutional restrictions, like the Stability and Growth Pact, like regulations on state aid. But there are also market restrictions for countries with a relatively high debt level. So even if you ease the legal restrictions, some countries are still facing market restrictions. And these are, of course, countries with relatively high debt levels. And therefore, what is required is, of course, also fiscal space at the EU level, either by EU taxes or by EU debt. Next slide, please. And as treaty changes at the national level are required, I think the draft by the S&D group for a new Article 126 is very useful, emphasizing that it's not only important to avoid deficits, but also to ensure the necessary investments to achieve the European economic, social and environmental objectives. And I think it's a good idea to say, okay, these investments should not be included in the planned or actual government deficit or government debt in the context of the Maastricht regulations. I think this is a very important treaty change that is required to give the breathing space at the national level. Next, please. So what I think one might discuss is a concept of project-based golden rules. Maria spoke of the necessity to include a golden rule, and I think it's important to specify a golden rule to necessary investments, and these necessary investments, in my view, could be defined as projects which help to finance EU investments which have externalities for the whole EU, like Maria said it. And so the idea is member states develop projects, and these projects will be approved by the Commission and monitored by the Commission. And once these projects have the approval by the Commission, they will then not be included in the planned or actual government deficit or government debt as the S&D draft envisages it. Next slide. Of course, we also need more fiscal space at the EU level, and in this regard, NGEU was a paradigm shift, which with a huge importance. But so far, this fiscal space that was created by NGEU was only justified as an exceptional response to temporary but extreme circumstances. So what we would need is a new article. I'm not a lawyer and I'm an economist, but needs a new article in the treaty that provides this form of financing, of raising its own debt and designing projects as a permanent ability, and saying, okay, this form of financing is possible for long-term investments with high externalities like climate change, defense, health, and infrastructure networks. Next, please. Here I can be short. I think it's only this is another proposal by S&D Group, which strengthens the role of the European Parliament in the decision process on own resources, which I very much appreciate. Next one, please. And this is more or less the same. Next, please. And here I have one point where I'm a little bit critical with the S&D draft, and that's the question whether the mandate of the European Central Bank should be widened to ensure a high level of employment and social progress in addition to price stability. And here I'm a little bit skeptical because if you have demand shocks like a global recession, in such a shock, employment and inflation go in the same direction. So there is no trade-off for the central bank. with employment and price stability. So in the case of demand shocks, it's not necessary to include something like this in the draft. In the case of supply shocks, something we are experiencing right now, there is a trade-off between inflation and employment. And of course, this creates a huge problem for the central bank, how to balance these two objectives. But if there is no longer a priority of price stability over employment, then the ECB can never deal with the shock, because in order to fight supply shock, somehow must raise interest rates, what the ECB is doing right now. This has at least temporary negative employment shocks, negative employment effects. So I think this is something one should consider very, very carefully. So let me include, we are confronted with unprecedented challenges. And I think to deal with the challenges, huge private and public investments are needed. And for this, ample fiscal space at the national, as well as at the union level is required. The current treaty has been able to provide this space, but only as an exceptional and temporary measures. And therefore, a new treaty must allow fiscal space as on a permanent basis. And for the Stability and Growth Pact, this implies we need these kind of project-based golden rules. And at the EU level, we need something like NGEU 2.0. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Bofinger, for these very important suggestions and for keeping with the time. So now, which is important also, we have next in the program is Nicoletta Pirozzi, which is head of the program on the European Union and at Istituto Affari Internazionali. So again, Professor or expert Pirozzi, thanks a lot for your participation, and please, if you can make it in 7 minutes. Thanks.
Yes, hope you can hear me. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, fine. So good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting event, and I'm very sorry not to be able to join you in person. So we agreed that I would focus more on defense and security aspects of treaty reform. And this is, of course, a sector in which the balance between the role of the institutions and member states, to which Professor Jacquet was referring, is particularly relevant. And we have to take into account when we think about future reforms in the European Union. Now, we know that the Russian aggression against Ukraine was a turning point for European security and defense, and this has led already to some key steps forward in the defense sector. The European Union has decided to finance the military support to the Ukrainian government. We had major decisions by member states, for example, Germany, that decided to finance heavily the defense sector, Sweden and Finland that decided to join NATO, Denmark that decided to join the CSDP. So time might be ripe for bold reforms and bold decisions in the field of defense. We have to clarify, first of all, what is our objective. If we assume that the objective is the creation of a European Defence Union, as it was also suggested by the Conference on the Future of Europe and by the European Parliament, we have to be clear on what these entail. And here I think that the San Malo Declaration from 1998 still has some validity, also in view of the recent developments in the field of defence. The EU must have the capacity for autonomous military action, backed by credible military forces, the means to decide to use them, and a readiness to do so in order to respond to military crises, while NATO has a predominant role in the territorial defence of Europe. Now, if we look at this objective, where do we stand and what do we miss? I think the treaties are already very clear about the fact that defense should be linked to a truly common foreign and security policy in the European Union, as it is foreseen, for example, in Article 24. So the European Defence Union cannot be decoupled from a common foreign and security policy. This means intervening on foreign and security policy provisions, for example, by expanding the powers of the High Representative and also in incentivizing forms of differentiated integration among member states in the field of foreign policy. If we look at defense and foreign policy matters, of course, we have an issue with the decision-making process. We have seen already that unanimity has very often led to late or suboptimal responses to crises and conflicts, and this should be amended somehow. So forms of qualified majority voting, we can reflect on what is the best formula, as Professor Jacquet was suggesting, should be considered both in foreign policy and in defense policy in the European Union. And I know that in the European Parliament there is widespread consensus on this. However, this is not enough. If we want a European Defence Union, we should also reinforce the legitimacy of this policy in the eyes of citizens and for the European Union overall. That's why the provisions of Article 36, in my view, should be somehow revised in order to enhance the role of the European Parliament in controlling and supervising this policy. We have seen already some changes, of course, with the Lisbon Treaty, but the intergovernmental blueprint of the common security and defence policy remains basically unaltered, and the European Parliament's role remains limited. That's why I think that information and consultation powers should be expanded, but also budgetary power of the European Parliament on military and defence matters. We know that nowadays, on the basis of Article 41, the operations having military or defence implications cannot be funded by the common budget. However, this impossibility creates unbalanced burden sharing among member states, and simply those that are more active are also those that are paying the most for military interventions of the European Union, and also impedes the civilian-military cooperation that has been always one of the objectives of the European Union. So I think that common budget should be used also for military missions. All the actions of the European Union, peacekeeping, conflict prevention, strengthening international security, shall be undertaken on the basis of the treaty, using capabilities provided by the member states. Now, I think this is something we cannot change in the short, medium term. It is not realistic to overcome this provision in the short term, for example, through the creation of a European army. However, what we need is a clear chain of command to mobilize effectively the European national forces, to be able to act also in this time frame. This means that we need a political authority, which could take the form of a Council of European Defence Ministers. We need a fully fledged headquarter in Brussels for military operations and not only for non-executive missions. And we need also national military contingents on call that can be mobilized by the EU authorities. The European Defence Agency has a role to play on this and should be turned in this new architecture into a truly European armaments agency. And this leads me to the final point, also because I see that the time is running short. I think that investments in the defence sector should be allowed through the common budget, because this is the only way that would allow the European Union to overcome the current ambiguity and inefficiencies. And I give a few examples. At the moment, defence investments by the European Commission, in particular by DG DEFIS, are done in a purely market logic. But defense is not a free market. Investments are done taking into account political and strategic considerations. So I think that treaty changes should allow the European Commission to invest strategically, but of course with a correctly balanced role for the member states, which actually own armed forces, and the European Parliament for democratic control over the European Commission. The lack of a stable budgetary framework has led us to use an off-budget instruments such as the European Peace Facility for short-term support to Ukraine and now for joint ammunition procurement. We have instruments such as the EDF, but also EDIRPA, EDIP, which are not framed in a coherent architecture, but respond more to ad hoc and short-term political purposes. So I think that all these reasons call for a rationalization of defense architecture, but also defense budget, and this should be done partially also through treaty changes. I will stop here. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a Nicoletta Pirozzi por estas interesantes.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta Pirozzi, for that very interesting presentation concerning defense and the reforms which are very pertinent because of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and respecting the timing so we can finish this panel more or less at 12. And we'll have the debate will have to be taking place without interpretation, unfortunately, because the interpreters will conclude at 12. I will give the floor to Marco Celonzo, who is the head of international policy of the European Federation of Trade Unions, which we've been working with. And Luca Vicentina really played and is a very active role coming to all the plenaries on the Conference on the Future of Europe, expressing the commitment to really help out. You have the floor, Marco. No more than 7 minutes.
I think I have just 5 minutes of interpretation. I will do my best. First of all, we support the idea that probably we must try to go to a revision of the European treaties. It's difficult, of course, but I think is really the moment. People have, in the Conference of the Future of Europe, we have found, also with citizens, with all the actors participating, the right challenges, and we have seen that we were in a new phase, in a new momentum. Probably in the follow-up of the Conference of Future of Europe, many people are not considering that these new challenges, including the investments that people have already mentioned, needed a total change in the way we are financing these investments, how we are financing change. Just keep in mind the doubling of the EU budget. In Italy, 1,000 billion euro to finance investment with the European debt. Let's say flexibility in the public budget, almost 10% of GDP allocated to temporary measures to respond to the COVID crisis and then to the war in Ukraine. And war in Ukraine has subsidies to companies is 1.5% of GDP coordinated by the EU or authorized by the EU. And still with the sustainable finance framework, we have the EU law as the ambition to orientate the investments for 1/3 of the financial market if the financial market will respond positively. So can you imagine how much money moves from the EU decision to company, people, etc.? And this cannot be done in the future with the current rules. For one simple reason, I will try to be very short because I don't have time. We are deciding in emergency. The EU has competence because it's deciding in emergency. We cannot plan these interventions and we cannot consider all aspects of sustainability when we decide what to do with these investments. Because we are legiferating in emergency all the time. So we need instruments that allow us to plan the way we use the money. Another thing is, if we want to change the way we produce, work and consume, because this is what we are trying to do with this huge amount of money, we need those who produce and those who work and consume on board, the social partners. Employers' representatives, workers' representatives must be part of this process. The current rules do not allow the social partners to be always at the center of the process. And frankly speaking, it's very difficult to have a just transition, to have the transition without us. And this is something that you can, I mean, regardless of different capacity we have at national level to go to perform industrial relations. This is something that we have to put on board. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to have the green transition, to go for strategic autonomy, or to address the demographic change. All things that were being addressed in the list of things that Gabriel Bischoff puts as a reason, and also Rodriguez put as a list of things that need a revision of the treaties. There is also another aspect that we have to consider, the word security. Now people also, we see in our movement, the people ask for security. Of course, we cannot intend security also only as the fear of an external enemy that today is materialized. We can succeed in the open strategic autonomy agenda only if we conceive the security world in at least 3 dimensions. Health, because the COVID is still there, showed that we were very poor in protecting our people, the health of people. So this is crucial. We have to find a new way to enhance the EU action in the health sector, income protection, and of course, defense and security, as our experts said a few moments ago. But if we don't have these 3 dimensions, it's impossible to continue and to provide their answer to people, the answer they want. It will be always partial. So I don't know if the treaty is equipped to that. Surely the passerelle clauses can help. Difficult to activate, but surely the treaty has been conceived to be an alive body of norms and rules. And probably there is space there to accommodate certain things. But more in general, let's try to think also to what rules we can change in the treaty. To do what? Another 2 things that in my view are crucial. One is to make more solid the social dimension of the EU. One idea is coming from your proposals, indeed, including the pillar in the treaty. Of course, the pillar, the European Pillar of Social Rights cannot, in my view, must be smartly included in the treaty, because the pillar must be remain something that can evolve in the course of time. Because it's already 7 years. You mentioned digital, probably someone. So we can mention the necessity to have a permanent social program inspired the model, like the European Pillar of Social Rights can be the model, but this program must be there. Otherwise, we will not have the effects we want. And the other thing is consider that the current rules have been interpreted basically in 2 ways since the last treaty change in 2006. One was the years of austerity, where people were managing mistrust. It was the time of egoism, no? In reality, our roundtable is called about solidarity. We have experienced it with the same legal framework, and someone said that with the same legal framework, we had a period of solidarity and sustainability in the last 4 years in situation of emergency, but we had so the same rules to serve 2 different views. That is why probably many of us have tried to talk about the Social Progress Protocol to include a tool that can help all of us to interpret, to mean the European Union mainly as an instrument of solidarity, and not as an instrument that try to put under control all our egoism that can be expressed by national governments or by groups of interests. But this is important to have these tools in the treaties. How to go toward the treaty, and I will go to the end of my speech. I mean, we don't have to do everything at once. You remember Amsterdam, Maastricht, Amsterdam, Nice, Lisbon. If we have the ambition to change everything in one single change, it's impossible. But if we are smart enough to imagine something that in the course of the time, in 2-3 times can bring us to the EU we want, and many other challenges have been mentioned, probably we can succeed. I hope I covered more or less the points I wanted. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Marco. And many thanks for the interpreters also for staying a few minutes after the hour to at least complete the panel with interpretation. Now we move on to the debate. I take also advantage of the last comments by Marco, because since we hear still among some colleagues, I will not say the majority in the group, but in any event, important voices that are not fully convinced of, I will say, the majority view in favor of a new treaty that is more social and more federal. Well, precisely, if I will say, if we are coherent with our own ideological position, which is to rebalance the market freedoms in the Union with the social rights, and leaving aside the discussion on qualified majority voting and so on that we have had, that in itself implies a treaty change, because we cannot incorporate the European Pillar of Social Rights or the Social Progress Protocol into the treaty without changing the treaty. So if we, as pure social democrats, and we don't even want to talk about decision making, about more powers to the parliament, which is more like the traditional federalist program, but then let's think of the social dimension. So can we really achieve our goals as social democrats without rebalancing in the treaty market freedoms with social rights? I don't think it's possible, but of course it's up to the colleagues also to see if there are other views to achieve this. Of course, the European Pillar of Social Rights that was approved in Gothenburg was a big achievement. Maria Joao played a big role because she led the report in this parliament about this. But this, as you know, it's a non-binding document. Important, but non-binding. So I think this is just one example. We can think of others. But I give now the floor to the members, maybe Pascal. But Pascal didn't have the chance in the first round. It was his fault because he was late, but please. Pascal, no, I was joking, please.
Just a question. When you are talking about the social pillar, why nothing about sustainability and environmental issues? It's, I think we are in 2023, so where is the social possibility and issue without a question of sustainability? So yes, because I read the draft, and then the draft talk about the social issues, and of course it's very important. But maybe for the SND, it's important to take the question of sustainability too. But so, it was my only point.
Other, yes?
Moi, je préfère parler en français. Je suis physicien informaticien, je suis membre du European Physical Society. Et j'ai deux questions. Moi, je trouve l'action commune des institutions européennes avec la Commission européenne très positive. Je parle de l'exemple du Covid. Il a un très bon écho dans la population européenne. Et je demande, je ne sais pas si c'est possible, de prendre une procédure spéciale que les institutions européennes peuvent agir en cas d'urgence sans demander les autres États, le prendre dans votre modification du traité. Je trouve c'est pas seulement Covid, c'est la crise d'énergie avec la guerre en Ukraine, c'est bien terminé. L'achat des armements groupés pour l'Ukraine, c'est aussi très bien. Alors, est-ce qu'il y a une possibilité, parce que c'est une bonne action avec de bons résultats, de prendre ça dans les modifications des traités et de donner plus de transparence au Conseil d'Europe? On ne sait jamais qu'est-ce qui se passe là, on ne sait jamais quelles sont les discussions, il n'y a pas de transparence. La deuxième chose, c'est le pouvoir démocratique pour les institutions européennes. C'est le professeur Jacquet qui propose les partis politiques européens. Moi, on va voter pour les partis politiques, ils sont pour 2, 3, 4, 5 ans. Après ça, ils oublient toutes les promesses, ils commencent à se quereller avec les autres partis pour rester dans leur position. Alors, moi, c'est que je suis plus une adepte pour la démocratie participative. Ça veut dire comme en Suisse. Il y a un référendum pour la population en cas de modification des lois, de proposition de différentes lois. Je parle d'un référendum européen, ça donne une participation démocratique, vraiment une démocratie aux institutions européennes. Voilà.
Merci. Margarita?
Thank you very much. I'd like to raise one point linked with the presentation of Professor Peter Bofinger. My point is on the role of the Parliament. So there are clearly two deficits of capacity of the Parliament to act. The first one is in the framework of Article 122. It means it was the article used for different financial initiatives to answer to crisis. Okay, it was very well done, but the role of the Parliament is zero. It means the Parliament has no role when the base juridique, the legal framework, is Article 122. I'm not so on to have concrete points on Article 122 as Professor proposed, but I think that it must clarify the role of the Parliament. My second point is also on the role of the Parliament. It means on the revenue side of the EU budget, the role of the Parliament has no role. And I think that this is something that must be modified, of course, from one point and the other. Parliament could found different initiatives, for example, to create the RRF working group, but we did it because we demanded it. It's not d'office, it's not because we have the role to do it. Thank you.
Yeah, those are very good examples that you cannot solve within the Lisbon Treaty, because Passarel you cannot apply it to the own resources because it's only consultation, and then in Article 122 there is not even consultation. It's only the decision by the Council on issuing debt, which is I don't know. Pedro, yeah. Sorry.
Well, just one short question for Pervenche Beres. Glad to see you back in the Parliament. I see you're not particularly enthusiastic about the idea of treaty change, just a little bit perhaps. But if anything can make the difference is the enlargement. So, but even in case of the enlargement, if I understood correctly, the ambition of treaty change should be limited, meaning it should be targeted. What kind of agenda would you think that would be viable in the context of enlargement in terms of treaty change?
Mark? No? Other? Okay, but thank you for coming. Any other questions from the room? No? Okay, well then we will go to the answers by the panelists in reverse order. So, Marco.
No, just one remark on sustainability. I didn't get time, but for me, the answer is very clear. UN 2030 agenda, sustainable development goals are our point of reference. Now there is the reform of the economic governance with the legislative package, hopefully, if the legislative package will arrive. This will be, for me, a test, because there will be the possibility to include, for us, the pillar is the SDG 8-centered approach to SDGs. I couldn't tell it, but it's officially our strategy. It's a test because you have a huge change in the way the EU operates. The Parliament is sometimes involved for certain legislative pieces, is involved for certain others not. So it's really a test for me for the future of Europe, this reform. Let's see, but I fully agree.
Well, just to complement that, in the work that Gabi is doing in the report, we have, as socialists, we have proposed climate neutrality to be added to the treaty. I don't know if this goes in the category of the bow and that Professor Jacquet said before, like nice to have, but you should know that the Lisbon Treaty doesn't mention climate change. Because it's a reflection of its time, which is paradoxical. It's only, there is a general chapter on environment, but nothing specifically on fighting climate change. So we have to take this into account. Now will be Nicoletta.
Thanks, Tomek. Thanks, Mr. Chair. There were no specific questions on defense, so I think I will leave it there.
Okay, well, you could always add something, because I'm sure that with 7 minutes, but okay, thank you. Then it's Professor Bofinger. There was a question, by the way, on that. This is also important because there is also a bit the view, Pervanch, but then you can also, you have the last word in the order. But there is but when you mention what happened with the COVID, there is this idea that a bit the treaty is kind of chewing gum, and that you have the political will, you can do everything. But be careful with the grammar, because the German Constitutional Court, which of course I don't recognize legitimacy, is the European Court, but they have said, recovery plan is a one-off. If you want to do it permanently, you have to change the treaty, in our view, okay? So let's not think that we can, well, we can do a lot with political will. The treaty has many flexibility, but maybe we can go to the breaking point. So if we want to have a permanent capacity, I think it's very relevant, Professor Bofinger, what you explained.
Yeah, thank you very much. In my short intervention, I only want to say that we need to redesign the treaties in order to make a permanent facility possible, not only as a kind of exceptional crisis device, and of course this would also have to include an important role of the Parliament in this process.
Yes, this is a critical point, because this is what we want to, what we set to achieve also as a political group, even before the conference, which is to go to a full federalization, on a more complete federalization, which means that the Parliament has more equal powers with Council when it comes to approving the budget on the revenue side, as Margarita reminded, but also on taxation and on debt. Those are the three key points that a traditional Parliament is entitled to decide on. But Pervanch, you have the last word.
Thank you. There were several questions raised where I would like to answer, but before doing this, I would like to share with you some thought. The treaty change will not happen overnight, because in my understanding, the leverage will be the enlargement treaty. So this is the time frame. And ahead of this time frame, you're allowed to think short, mid-term, and long-term. And let's say that the enlargement will be the long-term, even though we need it to be as quick as possible. But this means you also, I think you should also think what could be asked to the last useful presidency, which is the Spanish one. What do we expect from them? Because they are the ones who are going to settle the scene for the debates in the campaign. So it's a very critical one. And second, in terms of time frame, to my understanding, I'm sure you have a full list of items you want to be dealt with in the next mandate. But for me, the next mandate, the cornerstone of the next mandate is not Next Generation EU, even though this is what I would like. But the reality is going to be get prepared for the enlargement. This is going to be the one. And this is where you have an avenue to define what you want in terms of institutional treaty change. When it comes to, I was of course very pleased to be on the same virtual roundtable with Professor Bofinger. But I think there's one dimension that was not mentioned, and I cannot leave this room without mentioning it, which is the question of, the one who knows me will not be surprised, aggregates fiscal stance. Because all the debate I can see are now focused on a bilateral discussion between member states and the Commission. And this is more than dangerous. It's helpful somehow because then you can introduce some tailor-made adaptation of the request, but you give up the broad overview and the room for solidarity and interconnection between the economies. And you cannot leave this only to the Commission. I mean, if you kill this, you kill any space for real solidarity. And going back to the treaty change, please, when you will go through, and I'm sorry because maybe I went too quickly through the amendments that were proposed by the group for the Verhofstadt report, I didn't see anything about the appointment and the nomination process in the ECB and blah, 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 but it's a point you should never forgive. The Parliament got new power when it comes to the SSM, SRM, SFR, and all the other stuff we have built since the banking union. You should have the same when it comes to the ECB member. Now, on the management of crisis, you're fully right. We need to have something, if we have a treaty change, we need to have something about crisis management, except, you know, what a crisis is something you have not expected that's going to happen, that is happening. So you always have to be quite flexible, agile, as we say now, and reactive. But you're right, there's a point here that we need to take into account. Last point on the outcome and the policies, and then I will answer Pedro. And it's a point I share with Professor Bofinger. I think on the avenue of the solution put on the table because of the COVID was the borrowing capacity, and also never forget SURE. These are two very, very important tools that for our political family is an achievement that we need to fight to make sure, for many, many reasons that I don't have time to develop here, to share it as an asset that we need to consolidate. But for this, it's the same as the social pillar. This is not, the question is not to have it written in the treaty. The question is how to decide on such policies. Because, for example, if you write the social pillar in the, for example, if I had to do something about the social issue, I would much more insist to have qualified majority for 151, 52, and 53, and another hierarchy of norms, of standards. Because today, as you know, social standards, Article 9 is useless because social standards, they come after the free movement of goods, people, and capital. And this is a real issue. But to write the social pillar in the treaty, in 10 years we will have to come back because, or in 5 years or in 3 years, and it was already mentioned that on the digital dimension it's not there enough. So and this was the reason why I said no to the constitution, because it was putting in the constitution policies. And this is not the place. The policies is the dynamic you have in the discussion between political families or among political groups. What you need to put in the treaty are the way, the rules for the common behavior. And it's the same about the environmental dimension that Pascal mentioned. Of course, you need to add climate, but then you also need to add biodiversity. Please don't forget this one, including when it refers to health. So I think to fight for content of policies in the treaty change, this is not the best. I mean, for me, this is not the priority. The leverage that we can have when we have the treaty change is to make decision-making easier. This is why I think I've already mentioned it in the beginning, but I will come back to this. The question of enhanced cooperation and the Pascal clause needs to be revisited because they don't work. and the spirit in which I would like us to be able to revisit them is to make sure that no member state can block a decision where a majority wants to go, and that somehow you can build a constructive abstention or non-participation or de facto non-participation, because otherwise you would not be able to move ahead. And of course, it doesn't mean that if you put all item under QMV, that the decision will be by QMV. But, and Professor Jacquet very rightly said it, in the Council, even when there's a field in QMV, they don't vote, they don't go. It's not like in the Parliament. In the Parliament, when you're fed up with a discussion, you close the discussion, you put a deadline, and you go for the vote. In the Council, they don't do it like this. They go on discussing until they understand there's a majority there. And even if you have on the paper QMV, it will go on happening like this. So the only thing you need to make sure is that the 2, 3, or 4 countries among 35 that will be completely against will keep silent and will not oppose. So this is the first basket, which is for me very important: QMV, close passerelle, and enhanced cooperation. Second is rule of law. You need to do something out of this, because otherwise, including in our, put your house in order before you can tell to the world that they have to follow your own rules in terms of democracy, freedom, and blah, blah, blah. And the third package is, of course, the institutional setting. It was not on the agenda this morning, but the question of the dimension of the Commission, the representation of the member states in the European Parliament, a subject I think you know by heart. This, of course, is a must-do in the next treaty change. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you to Pervanche and to Professor Bofinger, Nicoleta Pirozzi, to Marcos Cilento, that's a Spanish pronunciation. By way of a very short conclusion, because I think this has come up of the discussion, sometimes politicians, we focus too much, I will say, in the either or, right? And but also as a social democratic family, we have to, I will say, be cognizant that we have been, I will say, the political family, I will say, most successful in Europe, precisely for making creative synthesis, starting with the social dimension of the market economy. So I will say there is no opposition between fully exploiting the Lisbon Treaty, but also identifying the points that are lacking and that we need with another future, more federal and social treaty. Second, enlargement and deepening going hand in hand. This is very important. This is a big leverage to achieve the new constitutional, yes, yeah, I agree, to achieve the new constitutional treaty. And also no opposition between the improvements on content, on policies, and the improvement on decision-making, and that this goes to the point that you emphasize, qualified majority voting. I think it's a big priority for all of us. So 3 very important elements that I think we have to put together in our political puzzle. And all this done, of course, and this goes to the intervention by Professor Jacquet, in a very legally sound way. So if we put all this together, I think we have a great program ahead of us. So thanks a lot to all of you that participated today, to the MEPs also that came today, Pedro Silva and Pascal Durand, the last ones standing, but also to Mark and Margarita, to the panelists, Pervanche and Marco in the room, and Nicoleta and Bofinger online, and also to the staff that made this possible, Sandrine, Stephanie, Francesco, and Alejandro. I don't know if others have been involved. I don't want to. So to all those involved, a part of the ones mentioned, and we continue with future activities. Thanks.